Before the sun came up, before the children stirred, before the coffee was even weak in the pot, she was already awake. She moved through the dark house, the way you move through a place you know by heart. No lights yet. Light cost money, and money was the one thing the house did not have to waste. So she worked by the gray glow coming through the curtains, and she worked quietly, because the whole point was that no one should ever see her do it. She folded the blankets, she turned the towel over on its bar, so the thin, worn side faced the wall, and the good side faced the door. She smoothed the tablecloth across the spot where it had frayed, and set a plate over the stain that would not come out, and by the time the first knock could come at that door, the house was ready to be seen. No one taught her this in a classroom, no one wrote it down in a book, but every mother on that street knew the same unwritten rules, and every one of them followed those rules the same way, quietly, early, without complaint. This is not a story about how poor people lived during the Depression. You have heard that story. You have seen the photographs of the empty cupboards and the patched coats, and you already know that money was scarce and the years were long. This is a story about something harder to see. It is about the enormous, invisible effort it took to look like you were not drowning while you were. Because in those years, keeping a home presentable was not vanity. It was not pride in the shallow way we mean that word today. It was a line of defense. The swept porch, the clean collar, the table set for a modest supper, as if it were a feast. The front room kept spotless for guests who almost never came. These were not decorations. They were armor. They were small, daily acts of resistance against a truth the family refused to let win, the truth that they were being beaten. And here is the part that stays with you. That armor was mostly worn by the people with the least strength to spare, the mothers who slept the fewest hours, the children who were handed clean, mended clothes, and a single instruction they did not fully understand: hold your head up and do not tell anyone what happens inside this house. If you grew up in a home where the good dishes were never used, where one room stayed perfect and empty while the family crowded into the back, where your mother could turn a bare table into something that still felt like a family sitting down together, then you already know this feeling. You may not have lived through the 1930s yourself, but you were raised in the long echo of them by people who carried these rules in their hands and never once explained why. For the next while, we are going to walk through those unwritten rules, not as a list, as a way of living. We are going to look at what each small gesture was really defending against, what it cost the people who kept it, and the quiet dignity that was hidden inside all of it. Because the poorest house on the street was not always the one that looked defeated, and that was never an accident. The first rule was silence. Not the silence of an empty house, but the silence of work being done before anyone could see it. She rose in the dark, not because she loved the dark, but because the dark was private. And privacy was the only place where the family's real situation was allowed to exist. In the morning, the truth was heaviest. The morning knew how little was in the cupboard. The morning knew which bill was sitting unpaid on the shelf. The morning knew that the coffee had been stretched again, that the good side of the towel was wearing thin too, that the shoes by the door were closer to the end than anyone wanted to admit. And so the mother met the morning first, alone, and did her quiet work of turning a struggling house back into a respectable one before the children opened their eyes. She was not cleaning for herself. Understand that. A woman that tired does not scrub a floor at dawn for her own comfort. She was preparing the house to be seen. She was building, one small motion at a time, the version of the home that the world was allowed to look at. And here is the rule beneath the rule. The family had two homes living inside the same four walls. There was the home the family knew, the thin blanket, the counted potatoes, the father sitting too quietly at the end of the day. And there was the home the street was permitted to see, swept, mended, upright, giving nothing away. The entire unspoken job of the mother was to keep those two homes from ever touching. That was the weight she carried before sunrise. Not just the work, the separation. Now think about what that took. Not money, They had none to spare. It took discipline that no one applauded, performed for an audience that was never supposed to notice it was a performance. If she did her job perfectly, the reward was that nobody saw anything at all. Success looked exactly like an ordinary house. The better she was, the more invisible her effort became. We do not have a word for that kind of labor anymore. We have outsourced almost everything she did, by hand and by will. But there was a dignity in it that the modern home traded away without ever being asked if it wanted to. There was an arithmetic she carried, too, that no one else in the house could see. She knew, at any hour, exactly what was in the kitchen. Not roughly, exactly. How many potatoes? How much flour, measured against how many days? Which meal could be made to appear twice if she was careful? She did this counting in her head, over and over, the way you touch a sore tooth to see if it still hurts. And she did it while smiling at the table, so that the counting never showed on her face. Today we would call that stress, or mental load, and we would be right. But she did not have a name for it. She only had the doing of it, every single day, before the sun came up and long after it went down. Then came the porch. If the inside of the house was the family's secret, the porch was its public face. And the porch was swept early, before the neighbors were fully awake, because the porch was the first thing the street would read. A swept porch said something. It said, "We are still here, we are still trying, we have not let go." A porch left dirty said the opposite, and everyone on that street knew how to read it. This is the part that is hard for modern ears to hear without flinching. The neighborhood was watching, not cruelly, most of the time, but constantly. In a working street during those years, everyone was struggling, and struggle made people observant. People noticed whose curtains stayed drawn too long. People noticed which child came to school in the same unwashed shirt 3 days running. People noticed when a porch went unswept, because an unswept porch was often the first visible sign that a family was starting to go under. So the broom came out every morning, not because the porch was dirty, because sweeping it was a message. It was a small, daily announcement to the world. Whatever is happening in here, we have not surrendered. We have almost nothing like that today. A modern home can fall apart on the inside for months and present a perfectly normal face to the street, because the street is no longer looking. We call that privacy, and in some ways it is a mercy. But something was lost when the neighbors stopped watching, because being watched was also being held. The swept porch was a promise made to people who would notice if you broke it. Nobody makes that promise anymore, because nobody is standing close enough to receive it. There is something else worth saying about that morning work, because the modern world has a hard time believing it was real. We are used to the idea that appearances are shallow. We are taught to roll our eyes at people who care what the neighbors think. Keeping up appearances has become an insult. But in a house where the money had run out, appearances were not shallow. They were structural. They were load-bearing. The swept porch and the clean collar were not about vanity. They were about holding a line that, once crossed, was very hard to walk back. A family that let itself look defeated often started to feel defeated, and a family that felt defeated stopped fighting. The mother understood this in her bones. The performance was not a lie told to the neighbors. It was a truth told to the family. We have not given up on ourselves, and I will prove it to you every single morning until this passes. Consider, too, how differently we handle a bad season now. When money gets tight in a modern home, the instinct is often to reach outward. To put it on a card, to order the thing anyway, to let the house go a little and trust that no one is close enough to see. The old home reached inward instead. It got quieter, tighter, more deliberate. It did not spend its way out of fear. It organized its way through it. There is no card to swipe against shame. There is only the broom and the soap and the will to get up before the light and do the work again. And then there were the children. This is where the story stops being about a house and starts being about the people who were shaped inside it. Because the children were sent out into the world every morning as living proof that the family was still holding together, and the proof was worn on their bodies. The clothes were often patched. There was no hiding that, and after a while, nobody tried to. But patched was allowed. Patched said careful. What was never ever allowed was dirty. A patch was honorable. A stain was a confession. So the collar was scrubbed until it was white, even when the rest of the shirt had gone gray with age. The hair was combed flat and neat. The shoes, whatever shape they were in, were wiped or polished until they caught a little light. They called it, in some homes, sending a child out decent, and it was a kind of armor, a thin one, sewn from soap and effort and a mother's refusal, but armor all the same, because a child in clean, mended clothes walked into that schoolyard protected from the one thing the family feared almost as much as hunger, not being poor. Everyone was poor, being pitied. There is a difference between the two that the modern world has half forgotten, and it sat at the center of everything these families did. Poverty was a condition. It came from the outside, from a world that had gone wrong, and there was no shame in a condition you did not choose. But looking defeated, looking uncared for, looking like you had given up, that was read as something else. That was read as a failure of will. And a mother would go without sleep, without a new dress for a decade, without 100 small things she needed, before she would let her child walk out the door looking like a family that had stopped trying. So the child became the family's ambassador, a small person carrying a message they did not fully understand. The message was, "We are poor, but we are not careless. We have less, but we have not let go of ourselves." And the child felt the weight of that, even without the words for it. There is a particular kind of memory that people raised this way carry for the rest of their lives. The scratchy feeling of a collar scrubbed too hard. A mother's hands turning them around at the door for one last inspection. The instruction, half tenderness and half command, stand up straight. Most of them did not understand it at the time. It only made sense decades later, when they became the ones standing at the door, turning their own children around, hearing their mother's voice come out of their own mouths. That is how these rules traveled, not written down, not explained, passed from a mother's hands to a child's shoulders and carried forward into homes that had never known a single hungry year. If you were raised by someone who could not stand to see you leave the house looking sloppy, who fussed over a stain like it mattered enough to weep about, you may have been living inside a Depression-era rule without ever being told where it came from. It came from a morning like this one, from a woman who learned, in hard years, that a clean collar was one of the few defenses a poor family had left. And the children absorbed all of it, whether anyone meant them to or not. A boy learned to run a rag over his shoes without being told, because he had watched it done 100 times. A girl learned to fold a worn collar under so the frayed edge would not show. These were not chores handed down on a list. They were survival, taught by example, in a language of small motions. Years later, those same hands would do the same things in kitchens and bedrooms their own parents never lived to see. A habit with no memory attached, just a certainty that this is how you keep yourself, no matter how little you have. But the armor had a cost, and honesty requires that we name it. Because a child who learns to perform wellness at 7 is a child who learns early that the truth is dangerous, that some things stay inside the house, that the face you show the world and the life you actually live are two separate things, and keeping them separate is your job now too. That lesson kept families upright. It also taught a generation to hide their pain behind a clean shirt, and some of them carried that habit, that instinct to smile and say we're fine, for the rest of their lives. We should hold both of those truths at once. The dignity was real. So was the price. To honor these people honestly, we cannot only admire the armor, we have to acknowledge how young some of them were when they first learned to put it on. And all of this, the silent morning, the swept porch, the scrubbed collar, was only the outer wall of the house. It was the face the family turned toward the street. But a face is not where a family actually lives. The harder work, the quieter defense, happened deeper inside, at the one place where the whole family gathered, and the truth was hardest to hide. It happened at the table. Because it is one thing to fool the neighbors from the porch, it is another thing entirely to sit your children down to a nearly empty meal and still make it feel like a family having dinner. That was the next rule, and it may have been the hardest one of all. The table was where the family could not hide from itself. The porch fooled the neighbors. The clean collar fooled the schoolyard. But at supper, the family sat down together and looked at exactly what there was. There was no audience to perform for. There was only the truth on the plates, and the truth was often thin. And this is where the mother did her most delicate work, because a poor meal, served carelessly, tells the children everything. It says, "We are in trouble." It says, "Be afraid." But that same poor meal, served with the whole ritual intact, tells them something else entirely. It says, "We are a family, and we are sitting down together, and this is normal, and you are safe." So the ritual was kept, even when the food could not be. The plates went down in their places. The hands were washed. Everyone came to the table at the same time, and everyone waited until it was time to begin. There might be little more than beans and bread, a thin soup, a few potatoes made to look like more than they were, but the form of a family dinner was held in place like a frame around a small picture, and the frame did more work than the food. Think about what the mother was actually protecting. She was not protecting them from hunger. She could not. She was protecting them from fear. A child who eats a small supper inside a calm, ordinary ritual does not necessarily know that anything is wrong. The ritual absorbs the scarcity. It carries the weight so the child does not have to. That was the whole point. The mother took the fear onto herself and handed the child a normal evening, and she did it while doing the arithmetic in her head, while knowing that tomorrow's meal depended on what was left after this one, while smiling and passing the bread and making sure no one reached for a second helping there was not enough to give, usually by taking less herself, quietly, so that the shortage showed up on her plate and nowhere else. This is one of the quietest sacrifices of that whole era, and it happened at almost every table. The person who managed the food was very often the person who ate the least of it. Not because anyone asked her to, because she had already counted, and she knew. We have almost entirely lost this, and we lost it without noticing. The modern table is often not a table at all. It is a counter, a couch, a car, a screen. Everyone eats at a different hour, a different food, in a different room. The meal has more variety than any Depression-era family could have dreamed of, and less meaning than that thin bowl of soup. We gained abundance and misplaced the ritual that used to turn eating into belonging. A modern family can share a house and never once sit down to look at each other. A poor family in the 1930s, with almost nothing on the table, would have found that unthinkable. The food was scarce. The gathering was not negotiable. But the ritual had a second job, and it was not gentle. Because the family did not only have to survive the meal, it had to be ready, at any second, to be interrupted by the world. That was the knock at the door. A knock, in a house like that, set off a quiet, practiced transformation. In the space of a few seconds, the everyday home became the visiting home. The pot was covered, so no one could see how little was in it. The worn towel disappeared and the good one came out. The everyday face went away, and the company face came on. If a neighbor or a relative was about to step inside, they were going to see a household that was managing. They were not going to see the thin supper or the tired truth of the day. They were going to see a family that had things under control. There was a whole second self that lived in that house, kept ready for company. The best cups that only appeared for guests. The chair that got offered to a visitor while the family made do. The cheerful voice that came out to greet someone at the door, no matter how heavy the day had been 30 seconds earlier. None of it was dishonest, not really. It was courtesy, and it was pride, and it was protection, all braided together. You did not burden a guest with your troubles. You did not give the neighborhood something to talk about. You put your best face forward, because your best face was one of the few things poverty could not take from you. and children learn this transformation the way they learned everything else in that house. By watching, a child saw the home change in seconds and understood, without being told, that there was a private version of the family and a public one, and that switching between them cleanly was part of what it meant to be respectable. That there was a way things looked to us and a way things looked to them, and you never, ever let the two get confused in front of company. Which brings us to the strangest and most telling room in the whole house, the front room, the good room. Almost every home like this had one. A parlor, a sitting room, a front room kept a cut above the rest of the house. The best furniture was there. It was clean, it was arranged, and most of the time it was empty. The family did not live in it. The family crowded into the kitchen and the back of the house, into the warm rooms, the working rooms, and left the good room waiting. Waiting for guests, waiting for the minister, or the relatives, or the important visitor who came only a few times a year. To modernize, this makes no sense. You have a small house, money is short, space is precious, and you seal off your nicest room and refuse to use it. Why? Because that room was not really furniture. It was a statement. It was the proof, kept in reserve, that this family had not been reduced to nothing. It said, whatever we are going through, we still have this. We still have a room fit to receive people. We are still the kind of family that keeps something nice for company. In a life where almost everything was worn thin and stretched to the limit, that one preserved room was a small, stubborn island of dignity. It was worth more unused than used. Using it would have worn it out. Keeping it perfect kept the promise alive. If you grew up decades later in a house with a living room nobody was allowed to sit in, plastic still on the good sofa, a room you passed through but never really occupied, you were living in the long shadow of this exact instinct. Most people who grew up that way never knew where it came from. It came from here, from a generation that learned, in hard years, to keep one thing untouched, so they would always have proof that they were still standing. There is a modern echo of that good room worth sitting with for a moment. We do not keep anything in reserve anymore. Nothing is saved, nothing is set apart, nothing is kept perfect for a moment that matters. We use everything up and replace it, and we call that freedom, and in many ways it is. But a family that keeps nothing sacred also keeps nothing to reach for when times get hard. The old home kept a room, a set of cups, a good day, in reserve. Not out of stinginess, but because having something held back, something protected, was a way of believing in a future worth protecting it for. When you save your best for a better day, you are quietly insisting that a better day is coming. And through all of it moved the children who knew, not the little ones. The little ones were protected, and that was the point. But in most families there was an older child, or a middle one, old enough to have figured it out, old enough to know that the father had come home early too many times, old enough to understand what the low, tight conversations after bedtime were about, old enough to know that when the family said everything is fine, it was not a fact but a job. And that child learned, often without a single word of instruction, the hardest rule in the whole house. You do not talk about it outside. Whatever you know, you keep. The trouble stays in this family. You do not tell the neighbors, you do not tell the teacher, you do not give the other children anything to whisper about. You carry it, and you keep your face still, and you protect the family the way your mother protects it, by never letting the truth show where it could do damage. We have to be honest about what that did to a child. It was loyalty, and it was strength, and there was something genuinely noble in a young person who could hold a family's secret and keep walking with a straight back. But it was also a heavy thing to hand to someone so young. A child who learns that the truth is dangerous, that feelings are a threat to the household, that the job is to look fine no matter what is happening inside. That child often grows into an adult who cannot ask for help, who smiles through trouble by reflex, who was so well trained to protect everyone else that they never learned how to say, out loud, that they were struggling too. Many of the people watching this were raised by exactly that child, grown up, the father who never complained, the mother who never let anyone see her cry, the parent who carried every burden silently and called it nothing. That silence was not coldness, it was training. It was a rule learned at a kitchen table in a hard decade and carried, unspoken, for the rest of a life. And then, once a week, the whole system paused and put on its best. Because Sunday had to look like Sunday. No matter how thin the week had been, Sunday was set apart. The better clothes came out, the ones kept back and cared for, all week for this one day. The shoes were polished the night before, faces were washed, hair was combed, and the family became, for a few hours, its most finished self. Maybe there was church. Maybe there was just the idea of church, the shape of a day that was supposed to be different. The radio might play, low, in the front room. The meal, if it could possibly be managed, was a little better than the rest of the week's meals. The one time the table tried to rise to the occasion. Sunday was not about religion alone. Sunday was about rhythm. It was the family's way of insisting that time still had a shape, that the week was not just an undifferentiated grind of getting by, that there was still a day worth dressing for. As long as Sunday looked like Sunday, the family had not come apart. The moment Sunday stopped mattering, something important would have been lost. So they kept it, and they dressed for it. And for a few hours they were not a family surviving a hard decade. They were just a family, in their best clothes, on their best day, the same as anyone. That is the deepest thing about all of these rules, and it is time to say it plainly. None of them were really about appearances. Every single one of them, the swept porch, the set table, the company face, the good room, the child's silence, the Sunday clothes, was about the same thing. It was about a family refusing, in 100 small daily ways, to accept that they had been defeated. The house was the battlefield, the gestures were the resistance, and the war was fought, mostly in silence, by people who never once called themselves brave. And they carried it, most of them, all the way to the end. The habits did not stop when the hard years did. The woman who counted potatoes in 1934 was still turning off lights in empty rooms in 1974. The child who learned to keep the family's secret grew into the parent who never let anyone see them worry. These rules did not belong to a decade. They belonged to the people who learned them, and those people took them everywhere they went, into better years and easier houses, long after anyone needed them to. That is why the memory is still so close for so many families. It did not stay in the 1930s. It came home for supper every night for the next 40 years. So let us end where the day ended. Late at night, after the dishes were done and the children were finally asleep, the mother would move through the house one last time. She would straighten the chair, she would set out what needed to be ready for the morning, and then she would stand for a moment in the kitchen doorway and look at it, the worn table, the mended curtains, the everything that was old, the everything that was cared for, and she would reach over and turn off the light. That was the whole thing, right there, in one small motion. Not surrender, not despair. Just a woman who had held the line for one more day, turning off a light to save a few cents, in a house that had refused, again, to look defeated. Because that is what all of this was really about. Not the porch, not the collar, not the good room or the Sunday clothes, or the thin soup served with the full ritual. Those were only the visible parts. Underneath every one of them was a single, stubborn refusal, the refusal to let hard times decide who this family was. They were poor, many of them at times were frightened, but they were not careless, and they were not defeated, and they made sure the world could see the difference. That was not vanity, that was dignity, and it was carried, most heavily, by the people who complained the least, the mothers who slept the fewest hours, the children who learned to keep a straight face, the fathers who sat quietly at the end of the table and worried where no one could see. We have more now than they could have imagined. Bigger homes, fuller cupboards, 100 conveniences delivered to the door, and somewhere in all that abundance, we let go of something they held on to with everything they had. The idea that the dignity of a home has almost nothing to do with how much money is in it. That you can have very little and still keep your house, your table, and yourself with pride. If you were raised by people like this, people who turned off lights in empty rooms, who kept one drawer of saved odds and ends, who could not walk past a job half done, then you already carry a piece of this inside you. You may have spent years thinking it was just how your mother was, just something your grandfather did. It was more than that. It was a whole way of standing up straight when the world tried to knock you down, passed quietly into your hands. So tonight, maybe do one small thing the old way. Set the table, even if the meal is simple. Fix the thing instead of tossing it. Turn off the light in the empty room. Not because you have to, because it connects you to people who did these things when they had no other choice, and did them with a quiet grace we are still trying to remember. If this brought back a memory, subscribe to the Depression-era home, give this video a like, and tell us in the comments what your mother, father, or grandmother did to keep the home standing when times were hard. Share it with someone who remembers those hands, those habits, that quiet kind of strength. Your memory might be the reason someone else finally understands theirs. They were poor, but they were never ever defeated, and neither, in the end, are we, as long as we remember how they did it.